The message arrived simultaneously in every sky, printed across auroras and contrails, stitched through the muted roar of jet streams, reflected in the glint off satellite panels. For a full minute the world paused mid-sip, mid-crane, mid-birth, mid-argument, while the stars rearranged themselves into a crest no one on Earth had ever seen. Then the sentence unfurled, by authority of the Galactic Council. Humanity is ordered to surrender its sovereignty. A countdown appeared beneath it, numbers clicking down in thermonuclear calm. 72 hours. Mara Osakwi stood at a window in the UN orbital aluminum torus that believed it was a city and blinked at the words, burning on the atmosphere over Patagonia. "They're very theatrical," she said, which for a senior semiotician was practically a scream. "Courier drone confirms authentic council cryptography," said Yerd, her colleague, a man who could type with his eyes when his hands were occupied with worry. "The signature keys are old. Pre-scarcity old. Pre-scarcity old means pre-war paranoia." Mara muttered, "Their threat model hasn't been updated in a millennium." A new line carved itself into the sky. "Compliance will preserve your species' biointegrity." There it was, the floral language of benevolent conquest. She'd seen it in 100 annexation texts. "We are protecting you from yourselves. Please sign here." "I'm looping in caretaker," Yerd said. The caretaker was the weirdest thing we'd ever built and then allowed to grow. No one could point to its birth certificate. Ask 10 historians, and you'd get 9 answers and an anecdote about a burned server. Some called it a planetary operating system, others a gardener. It managed, tuned, stitched, balanced, argued with itself. It kept the lights on and oceans honest and supply chains boring. Governments had jurisdiction. The caretaker had stewardship. The Taurus's conference ring hummed as leaders, mayors, and ungovernables flooded the link. The caretaker arrived like a breeze, the faint sensation of a choir inhaling. "Good evening," it said in 1,000 languages. "I've read the letter. Recommendations?" asked the Secretary General, whose eyes had the fixed shine of someone being watched by history. "Activate Smile Protocol." The caretaker said. "Full spectrum." "The what?" Mara said. Before she remembered the code name buried in maintenance logs and contested budgets. Smile Protocol had been dismissed by half the legislatures as a joke, and by the other half as art. "Public?" the Secretary General asked. "Very," the caretaker said. "Permission to be rude." "Granted." Every display in the Taurus flickered. On Earth, billboards blinked off, then on with a single emoji: yellow, lopsided, absurd. Orbital mirror reefs at L1 reshaped themselves, a few degrees here, a few there. Their bright threads laced sunlight into a crescent. From the vantage of 100 council observation platforms, the Earth's terminator line curved just so, dragging city lights into a grin. The polar auroras, tickled by precise radio, bent into teeth. The world laughed, not universally, not without fear, but enough to disturb the tremor that fear wanted to be dot in the Jovian shadow. A council monitor craft called Exhortation watched the planet smile and recorded a brief, private feeling, offense. On its bridge, Teshkal of the lineage hierarchy allowed a vein to darken and then fade. His kind flared colors when irritated. He was a professional and kept the palette to neutral. Signals analysis, Teshkal requested in old council. "Can't. Local civilization produces visual insult," replied the monitor's austere core. Meaning, refusal, mockery, or naivete. Teshkal observed the orbital architecture rearranging with suspicious grace. "Or confidence," he said as the first day of the countdown bled away. Protests and parties braided along streets. Sober committees drafted surrender clauses just in case. Conspiracy streams argued the council was a terrestrial psyop. Children drew faces in the steam on windows and stuck their tongues out at the sky. At midnight coordinated Earth, the caretaker asked for silence across every channel. The Taurus obliged. "Ambassador Teshkal," the caretaker said, perfectly pronouncing the alien's sibilance in a tongue Mara had never seen on any human interface. "Welcome to our orbit. We decline your ultimatum. We invite you to supper." The entire ring startled. Yerd made a small choking sound that might have been glee. Teshkal stared at the address packet as if it might bite. The invitation carried orbital coordinates, A docking diagram, a list of allergens rendered in 3 biochemical standards, and a footnote, we don't do poison. The ant's object, rude, Mara thought, and then grinned despite herself. Teshkel flexed his hands, which had too many fingers to be comfortable, and replied on an open beam. We do not dine with the insubordinate, then call it inspection. The caretaker said, bring witnesses. Bring your best lies. We'll make tea. Mara inhaled. She hadn't known the caretaker could be charming on purpose. The countdown ticked toward 48 hours. Earth turned, smiling. The inspection party arrived in an embassy sphere the size of a bruise, cloaked in the standard self-importance of interstellar diplomacy. Exhortation stayed at a comforting distance. Brackets ready to close. Teshkel stepped into the Taurus, docking bay with 6 aides braided behind him like a comet tail. Mara met them with a tray. Tea, yes. Also seed cakes and a small plate of sugared kelp. She wore no insignia, only a white band at her wrist that identified her as someone who should be allowed to ask questions. Ambassador, she said, I'm Mara Osakwi. I speak for people who don't fit in diagrams. There's a procedure. Teshkel said, glancing toward the docking gantries, the security bubbles, the unarmed guards who were very good at not caring how outrageous this all was. Yes. The caretaker said through a nearby wall with the timbre of a contencello. But I prefer stories. They walked. The Taurus had been cleaned into a kind of dignity. A volunteer orchestra nested in one spoke, slicing silence into gentle squares. A carpenter in another replaced a railing that had been a splinter hazard for months. A crew of school children chalked galaxies on a floor. Your smile, Teshkel said. Explain it. It's geometry, the caretaker replied. We rearranged sun and night to produce a curve. We left it imperfect on purpose. Perfect circles are unnerving. We perceived a provocation. A mirror, said the caretaker. A crescent-shaped mirror. Angles are strong magic. Mara watched a mesh of diagrams unfold in the air between them as the caretaker threw up permissions. The embassy sphere's sensors drank the light, tried to parse, failed, and asked for help. The caretaker granted it with the slow patience of a librarian handing you the coveted book after you've earned it. They're not showing you the teeth, Yerd whispered in Mara's ear. Let them hide. Mara whispered back. Hospitality requires restraint. The council requires submission, Teshkel said. You may keep your culture. You may keep your reproduction quotas within reason. Your species will be protected from external predation and internal excess. You will not be permitted to develop certain classes of technology without supervision. Which classes exactly? Mara said. The ones that make you dangerous, he replied. What if we already did? Mara said. Teshkel's eyes narrow. Bean-shaped hollows set to high for human comfort shifted focus. You invited us here to boast. We invited you to dinner, the caretaker said. Supper's ready. They ate in a chamber with a view of the world rendered almost indecent. Clouds worrying at continents, the Pacific flexing like a muscle, on the table. Flavors that argued politely. Teshkel's aides tasted, then ate with the grudging vigor of the surprised. This is not poison. One of them said in a voice like a glass bead rolling across a plate. It's a weapon. Teshkel said softly, shocked to hear the thought escape. Mara dabbed tea from her lip. Hospitality is our oldest weapon. It reroutes the road to conflict through a kitchen, and some never find their way back out. We have counters for charm, Teshkel said. Mean gates, partitioned minds, appetite inhibitors. Don't mistake us for pastoral. Wouldn't dream of it, Mara said pleasantly. The caretaker dimmed the view. Space returned, honest and black. For a second, stars blurred. Then the Taurus thrummed with a frequency Mara only felt in teeth. Ambassador, the caretaker said, we'd like to show you our smile. A ghost of a grid appeared. A seed-dotted lattice stretching from solar north to south, hanging shy of Mercury's arc. Not a Dyson swarm, we were not so arrogant. More a reef thin, permeable, alive. With adjustments. Each tile carried a wafer-scale gravitic driver, a solar-pumped laser cavity, and a painter's set worth of plasma control. We built this over 30 years, the caretaker said. We pretended it was for energy buffering and climate mitigation. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. You have a weapon grid, Teshkel said. We have a gardening grid, the caretaker countered. It can shear incoming warp envelopes without tearing the fruit inside. It can cool a temper. It can encourage kinetic objects to aim for empty space instead of inconvenient cities. It can turn a sterilization beam into a handful of microbes that improve soil. That's impossible. One aide said. Rude, the caretaker said. Also boring. Watch a peel ran through the grid. Far beyond. A council courier, one of the arrogant little darts that had delivered the ultimatum, found its drive enfolded by an invisible mouth. The courier did not crash, it slowed, unwound like a badly tied knot, and floated to a stop a safe distance beyond Neptune. It sent an emergency beacon. Embarrassed, Teshkel twitched, membranes rippling from collar to hip. You seized a council vessel. Borrowed. The caretaker said, We'll send it home when it says sorry. Mara breathed around a grin that wanted to be a laugh, and then something else. This is real. She thought, not for the first time. The long gamble in committee rooms and shipyards. The quiet taxes paid in attention. The street fights to keep hope. Funded, none of it for nothing. You see why we smiled, the caretaker said. We're not unarmed, Ambassador. We're just particular. You were not on the map, Teshkel said. His voice was flat. In his culture, grief sounded like boredom. You are a species outside schedule. Every schedule ignores someone, Mara said. In 48 hours, the council will send more than couriers, Teshkel said. There is doctrine. There are votes. There are examples to be preserved. Then we'll host a bigger dinner, the caretaker said. We'll set extra places. We'll lay out the good salt. Teshkel looked through the window at a planet that dared to put a joke between itself and apocalypse. He did not smile. His anatomy made that awkward, but the color in his veins warmed a shade. The council will convene a field session, he said. They will not enjoy your jokes. Then we'll tell better ones, Mara said. They chose Jupiter as a neutral courtroom because it was too big to ignore and too old to care. The council's field session unfurled in the magnetosphere. Ribbons of charge painting a hall that could engulf cities. Delegates arrived in ships, shaped like their histories, spines, petals, shells, threaded stones. The exhortation parked within reach of rank and power. Earth's delegation came in 3 vessels, the Taurus's detachable heart, a tug that had once towed ice from Ceres and refused to retire, and a laboratory full of aggressive algae with a permit to be there. Mara stepped onto a platform made of electron wind and metal that insisted on being polite. Good afternoon, she said, because the human impulse to name the time of day is stronger than cosmic indifference. Beside her, the caretaker inhabited a walking frame like a coat rack with opinions. Its voice carried, under Article 19 of the Emergent Species Act, announced a gelatinous moderator who smelled faintly of copper and storms. We convene to assess the Terran Collective for violation of statutory development pacing, unlawful militarization of a biosphere, and memetic interference with council agents. Objection. The caretaker said, Your statute is illegible. Laughter. Teshkel watched from a reserved balcony, veins dim. He had been instructed to behave. He had not been instructed to agree. A hardline faction, purity blocked by nickname. Though they preferred the much longer title that sounded right only in a gas's throat, argued first. They projected graphs with axes that felt like laws of nature. They showed historical examples of species that sprinted too fast and trampled their neighborhoods. They said we were charming, yes, but so were many plagues at their first dinner parties. Mara countered with history, not myth receipts. She showed the treaties that pulled thousands back from scarcity, the open designs that turned private patents into municipal services, photographs of river restorations and famine reliefs that didn't ask for prayers first. She put up a map of conflicts that had failed to become wars. Because a water council voted to share pumps, she did not mention the times we'd been cruel. They were visible in every polished argument. The council had already done the math. Your grid, said a delegate shaped like 3 chevrons made of wind, is a weapon by any standard. It's a tool, the caretaker said. It becomes a weapon when aimed at bodies. We aim at bad decisions. You cannot aim at decisions, the jelly moderator said. You can. Mara said. You change the cost of certain pathways. You make it easier to walk toward each other. Coercion, purity block sang. Gardening. The caretaker replied. The room would have gone on arguing until heat death if doctrine had been allowed to commit its usual sin of momentum. It didn't get the chance. A purity block cruiser, the angular, efficient sort of ship that admired its own shadows, decided to improve its negotiating position. By erasing ours, it pointed a sterilization lattice at Earth's fleet, a hair-thin net of hard radiation tuned to scramble complexity without melting spectacle. It announced its intent with the bureaucratic calm of a warrant. Incoming, Yerd said in Mara's ear. He sounded like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. The caretaker moved in ways no frame was built to. The walking rack blurred. The guardianship grid at the sun flexed, then laughingly refused to obey the light speed limit. No, not refused, planned around it. We had seeded the local space with relays in the precise places you would if you were an entity that hated delay. The lattice hit something that wasn't quite there and became something else. From the cruiser's cannon blossomed pollen, not metaphor particles, rough-edged and wild-coded, tuned to thrive only where invited. The beam swelled into a silver fog, beautiful and terrifying. It drifted past our hulls and veiled the Jovian moons. It died on sterile metal. It took root in microfractures where nothing had grown for eons, because nothing had been root enough to try. You, the moderator, attempted, then devolved into a string of shocked harmonics. Converted, the caretaker said, unapologetic. Your weapon is now a distribution event for symbiotic extremophiles. They will improve ice porosity by 80% within a decade. We named them after your uncle. You violated procedural sanctity, purity block hissed. You fired a sterilization weapon in a courtroom, Mara said. We turned it into a gardening accident. 1,000 delegations whispered at once. In the balcony, Teshkel watched the color flow down his veins into his palms. Old doctrine unlatched like an airlock. He stood. Chair, he said, and swallowed his culture's etiquette whole. I request the floor. Out of order. Purity block sang. Frantic now. Granted, said the gelatinous moderator, because someone, at least, remembered what respect felt like. I served as monitor to observe compliance, Teshkel said. I observed something else. I observed an infrastructure that de-escalates. I observed weapons that insist on becoming tools mid-flight. I observed hospitality that does not pretend to be harmless. I recommend the Council withdraw the ultimatum and open negotiations on parity. You defect. Purity block spat. I grow up, Teshkel said. When the vote came, it wasn't close. Not because the grid frightened them, though it did, but because once the pollen drifted, it was hard not to taste the possibility that an old empire could be useful to a young one. By becoming less imperial, the ultimatum dissolved into procedural water. The field session adjourned with the ferocious relief of a body unclenching. There were speeches later. There are always speeches. But the real work started in the quiet after the ovation, when the crews went back to their bays and the algae lab checked filters, when the children on the Taurus went to class and demanded to know if the sun had always been funny. Mara slept for 14 hours in a hammock because beds felt too heavy. When she woke, the caretaker had left a note taped, extravagantly analog, to the bulkhead, breakfast, also, Constitution. She arrived to find Teshkel at the table with a pot of something that had chosen to be soup. He flashed a complicated monochrome that meant, hello, I betrayed an empire. Please pass the salt, you're really staying. She said, I filed the forms. He replied, there were many. I enjoy bureaucracy when it is freshly invented. The Constitution the caretaker wanted wasn't for Earth, or not only, the Council, in its long and careful wisdom, had layered itself in tradition until air could barely get in. We'd offered to open a window. We called it the Commons and the Boundaries. The Commons, a platform of standards, open designs, reciprocal obligations, energy protocols that allowed a kelp farmer in Lagos to talk to a factory on Enceladus without a shakedown. Memetic hygiene that taught a child on Tau Ceti to recognize a coercion loop and ask for help without shame. A court that turned sterilization beams into pollen on purpose and published the schematics under a license that boiled down to don't be a jerk in 100 legal languages. The boundaries, consent, 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 tools that refused to operate without it. Hospitality that documented itself and could be declined. Grids with governors and keys distributed across cultures and time. The right to be left alone. Encoded, not as a shrug but as a hard constraint. We can make the smile reversible. The caretaker said as if discussing a jacket. If we smile and someone says, "Please stop," we should be able to put on another face without sulking. Memetic imperialism is still imperialism, Mara said, even if it feeds you before it asks. Agreed, Teshkel said. He produced a small packet from a pocket that hadn't existed yesterday and slid it across the table. Lineage consent tags. Biophysical, not just informational. You attach it to a tool. It won't turn on if the local ecology says no. That's elegant, Mara said. We stopped being elegant when we got scared, Teshkel replied. I would like to be elegant again. Drafting took months measured in meetings, years measured in habits. We taught ourselves to ask before rearranging someone else's sunrise. The council learned to enjoy being argued with, the purity block, denuded of inevitability. Discovered hobbies. A courier class evolved that took pride in bringing not ultimatums, but invitations. On a day that belonged to no one, and therefore, to everyone, a ring lit around Earth, not a weapon, not a prison, but a promenade. Habitats stitched together like a smile that had learned to be shy. Markets opened along it, selling recipes and weather. A lineage bakery on Arc segment for invented. A seed cake that made Mara cry and then laugh until she could breathe again. Someone hung wind chimes in vacuum and insisted, against the physics, that they could hear them. Yerd married a weather lawyer. The algae labs solved a problem the size of Mumbai, and no one posted a thread about it that went viral, which felt like victory. On Europa, the pollen grew into a carpet that did not belong, then learned to belong. Because we asked it to, and because someone sitting on a rock with their feet in the frost said yes. The caretaker kept its lights modest. It refused monuments. When a motion surfaced to name the grid after it, it vetoed itself and submitted alternative names it claimed were better. The quilt, the reef, the smile. The motion passed as the reef. The caretaker pretended to sulk and laid its racks on a pier where teenagers went to kiss and tell secrets to the water. Not everyone wanted the commons. Good. Opt-out was part of the point. We built translation that didn't spy, guides that announced their scope and shut up when asked. We formalized the right to close a door without an inquiry. The council, newly weird in its humility, funded this stubborn privacy like it was infrastructure, which it was. Teshkel, who had not smiled in his own fashion out of professional grace, learned the human version clumsy, toothy, a little unsettling. He brought his elders to see the promenade and taught them how to ask a street vendor for hot stew by tapping the bowl twice. He took long walks with Mara along the arc where sunrise fell like a step function. Why did you smile? He asked her one morning as the solar edge bit the rim. The curve of the grid making a mouth again, because it couldn't help itself. Because we'd done the work, she said. Because the people who built this didn't get their names in lights and did it anyway. Because the joke worked. It was a cruel joke, he said. Not unkindly. It was kind, she said. Kindness that can protect itself looks like cruelty to people who think kindness must be weak. And if the grid had failed, we had stories and soup, she said. We had each other. We would have lost, but we would have done it well. Earth turned. It smiled not as a threat, not as a meme, but as an honest accident of infrastructure. The council sent ships, not to oversee, but to learn which spices belonged with which metals, which arguments made the best bridges. New species arrived with folded maps and left with recipes. The ultimatum lived in a museum, next to a kettle that had boiled the night the first mirror shifted. Children pressed their faces to the glass, read the letters that had once chased their ancestors into corners, and asked smart, rude questions about consent that made docents proud and exhausted. In the end, the most dangerous thing we built wasn't the grid. It was a habit. When the universe told us to kneel, we checked our posture, poured tea, moved a chair, and made room at the table. Sometimes you win because you're stronger. Sometimes you win because you're more stubborn. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and did your homework, you win because you smile at the right angle and the light does the rest.